it's still very much the idea of, okay, how can we trigger payments to the communities, removing as many middlemen as possible, but also make it clear how these payments were triggered through an impact evaluator.
Yeah, I think our ambition is based on the fact that talent is distributed all around the world, but opportunity is not.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance. We are exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today's guests are David Dao and Sharfy Adamantine. They are the co-founders of GainForest. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd love to hear the origin story about GainForest and how the two of you got connected and how this project came to be.
GainForest was first conceptualized during a hackathon of the United Nations, COP23. So quite surprisingly forward-thinking for the United Nations back then, but they had this hackathon called How Can Blockchain Technology Tackle Climate Change? And I was kind of in my mid-20s looking for stuff to do, next stuffs to do, and also just looking forward to join a hackathon for free pizza. That's also a strong motivation. And I applied for that hackathon, learning a lot about how forests are currently handled in the climate space, that you pay people for not cutting it down. But there's a lot of trust issues when you pay. There's a lot of trust issues from the communities that they receive payments. And the monitoring of impact is kind of not very clear. And before that, I was an AI researcher in the US. And so I came actually without knowing anything about blockchain, more about interest in climate, and thinking, is there maybe a way to kind of have AI measurements evaluate if forests are standing or not? And then depending on that condition, pay out communities, right? And so we gathered this kind of initial hackathon team. We sat on a dinner table during the hackathon, and literally that's when the idea popped up in my head, and I came up with okay, how should we call our hackathon team? Brainforest, Drainforest, Guardians of the Forest, GainForest. GainForest. My teammates weren't really convinced, but we stuck with the name for now, we thought. We ended up winning the hackathon. We ending up in the UN to present it actually at COP23. That was the first time I attended the COP. And then that's it. So the team left. It was a hackathon project, right? It's but it stirred up some interest in the environmental space. And then a year later, roughly, so it was still a concept in my head. Indigenous community actually contacted us, a project led, asking if they can deploy this into their space. And I was like, I'm sorry, that's not real. It's just a hackathon idea. And they triggered my thinking, but what would it take to make it real, right? And so back then, that was 2017, the hackathon. I started my PhD during that at the same time. So I was busy doing research, but it always stuck in the back of my head. And then I think it got really real when I met Sharfy. So we kind of met in 2021, and you basically tried to push it to okay, David, we have been thinking about this idea for so long now. You either gotta do it or you're not gonna do it, right? And I think you deployed some clever tricks to make it happen.
Yeah, so we actually met on Clubhouse during 2021 when Clubhouse was a thing. And I was in a DeFi room, and everybody was talking about all of these cool different projects around the world and talking about this hypothetical, we can use this Web3 technology to give, people who are unbanked access to the financial services. And yeah, there was just a lot of talk about that. And yet I didn't really see any projects. So I asked the question to the moderator at that time, what are some projects that you know of that are actually doing these things? And the moderator gave an answer that David thought was not quite the whole picture. And so he interjected and said, hey, so there's this project that I've been thinking of. It's called GainForest. And I thought it was very interesting. So I messaged him. It's like, oh, I'd love to hear more about that. And so I think about a year after I met David, I was like, oh, we've been thinking about this for a while. Let's just make a quick MVP, kind of proof of concept. So we just kind of did that in a few hours, like over the span of 2 days, I think. And then we presented at South by Southwest. It was
that was really funny because we coded much of that prototype in an airplane, right?
Yeah, we did on the way there.
Yeah, to South by Southwest. Yeah,
a great place to focus.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we got a grant. When we presented it, there was someone in the audience who really loved the idea. We got a grant, and I thought it was the perfect time to just quit my job. And, we have the finances to make that happen. And so the first screen globe and the first dashboard was created, kind of
nice,
jumping off of that.
And there's multiple things now that GainForest is doing, and you have a team, kind of from those origins of a Clubhouse conversation and some pizzas and a hackathon. Like, where are we at today in the project, and like, kind of how do you describe it in its current form?
GainForest currently has 28 communities that we're supporting around the world. It grew organically. These are local communities, grassroots organizations in the global majority countries. And we are basically trying to, it's still very much the idea of, okay, how can we trigger payments to the communities, removing as many middlemen as possible, but also make it clear how these payments were triggered through an impact evaluator, right? That idea is, that structure that won us the hackathon is still the same, but these building blocks are more refined now. So we deployed something called conservation data income, where we say, okay, it's not just the satellite that's now monitoring the space when it triggers like payments. It's basically the communities collecting their own data, their own stories, and then uploading that. And we actually, over the years, kind of refined our data governance model. The communities themselves decide on the pricing. They vote and they form a data council where they decide on the pricing, the policy, how the data is used. And that's currently our model. We pay currently 1 cent per minute of bioacoustic recording in the forest, 5 cents per megabyte of drone imagery. And we started initially with paying 33 cents per tree image, but that has been stopped also in consolidation with the communities, saying this is not a mechanism that we can verify enough to make it scale. Yeah.
And I know that of those different community programs, co-design is a big part of what is the GainForest philosophy. Can you share more about that? And like, how do you go about this process of co-creating with the communities?
So the co-design process is super important to us because when I did my PhD, I did it in AI and research and very tech-centric. And as a scientist, you're on the other side. You're like in an ivory tower writing your papers, researching, but you wouldn't go to the ground and see actually, like, your problems are theoretical and you're solving them very theoretically. And so when we first tried to deploy GainForest, it was more on a scientific theoretical mindset. But once we deployed that idea into the field with the communities, we instantly realized you have to basically, that's not the way it works in order to scale solutions, because these communities are the beneficiaries of whatever we're designing. We have to be on the field to understand what are the problems. For example, technology needs to be localized. So we cannot just come in with our language and go to the community and say, fly the drone, make an auto mosaic, upload this on the GainForest data upload platform. No, we need to explain this in a way that the communities understand why it's important to govern the data as well, what we're doing with the data, data quality. And so we adopted an approach where we actually work with local champions, local NGOs, that we do the capacity building with on a personal level, almost one-to-one. And then they are the ones that help us localize the technology, localize the language. For example, in the Philippines, we have a really wonderful organization called Oceanus Conservation. Camille is leading that, where she is super scientifically curious. So we teach her like more on a like high level, like how these things work. And then she goes to the communities and she actually created children books to explain like restoration and conservation. She also used that kind of concept to explain what this technology is. Bioacoustic, for example, is we show like a time series of activity of sounds. And she just said, this is a clock, a colorful clock. It shows you like when animals are sleeping and they're like there, right? So it's really, really important to get that language right. And I think the best ones who can do this are local communities and local champions. And that's why we really love the co-design approach.
Yeah. And I guess just to add to that, a lot of the research that we would like to do in the future, and also what we've been doing now, is we would like to have local scientists come and also help us with sort of the algorithms or the research, just because there are different ecosystems in the world and different specialists, and who better to ask about the forest than the people who are living there or nearby. And ecosystem in South America is not the same as ecosystem in Africa or in Southeast Asia. And so you cannot generalize that between everything and between all of the different countries. So yeah, that's super important. And we also get to hear their concerns. For example, one specific concern is that we did not really think of in the beginning is about data privacy and data ownership. The moment we heard it, we realized this is something that we definitely have to take very, very seriously. But for example, if someone is protecting an area where there's an endangered species, you don't necessarily want people to know the location of these species or that there are even these animals in there. And so
for poaching reasons.
Exactly, for poaching reasons. And so it's important to also talk with the communities themselves, because we do have on one side conservation data income, but at the same time we have the questions on data privacy and like who is using the data. And so being able to talk about that openly with the communities help them understand and be part of the process where they understand our predicament of like, we would like to give people income for being able to protect the environment, but how does that look like? And how do we do that in a way that also protects their safety and the animal safety?
Totally. I also was surprised at that in my experience in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because I kind of started with the frame of like open source everything, you know, like how do we create structures where the data is liberated and shared? And then, you know, speaking with indigenous communities, not to overgeneralize in Aotearoa, but like consistently Māori folks saying like, actually the data privacy and kind of ownership of our indigenous data is like critically important. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's like a little more complicated than just open source and share. We don't have the same endangered species issues per se in New Zealand, but it still kind of comes to that same nuance about, And then my mind goes, ZK.
Yeah, exactly.
But also new use cases. So we have an AI assistant for indigenous communities called Taina, where they can naturally speak not in their language right now, because AI models are not that good yet, but in Portuguese and Spanish. So like non-English languages, which already is one step forward. And we realized that many of so we initially developed it for the XPRIZE to basically gather indigenous knowledge and wisdom and basically connect it with the data we collect on the field. But we gave them an option to share it or not, like certain kind of information. And what we realized is, it's super interesting, most of the data they don't want to share, but they still collect it. Because if you enable a use case where they can store the data locally, where you know that it's private, they can use it for archiving their own indigenous knowledge, right?
Wow.
And preserve that cultural identity.
Yeah.
So one of our indigenous scientists, Marina Amura, she called it a treasure box, where she can trust and put some of the stories of her ancestry into that treasure box to preserve it for the next generation. I felt that was really touching. And it's a complete new use case we hadn't thought about. Yeah, it's like, totally makes a lot of sense. Like languages are getting spoken less and less. These communities are getting driven out from their natural land and into urban settings. And so they're losing parts of their culture. How do you preserve it? And you can only preserve it with technology that has dignity, that is respectful, that is private. And if you cannot collect the data and share it with the world, it's still immensely valuable for the community.
How does the conservation data income piece work for data that communities decide not to share?
Yeah, so we don't reward that.
Right.
That is decided in the community that this use case, they get data income when they share it publicly for science and use cases.
Right.
If they collect it themselves and archive it themselves, then the current stand of the data council is to not pay out for this.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I can definitely see a use case in the future with ZK where you have the data and then you can ask some questions about the data and maybe that could be rewarded.
Totally.
But whatever, all the sensitive information could be abstracted out.
Totally. So for those who aren't familiar with ZK, zero knowledge, maybe as someone that has a technical background, how do you describe zero knowledge systems and this technology that's emerging?
There's actually a really famous example from one of the Fields medalists explain it, I think, very clearly. I like it a lot. So zero knowledge is basically the mathematical way to prove something to someone without revealing that you more information than what is needed to prove, right? Like, imagine you are colorblind, so you don't see red and green, and you basically on the other side, there's a person who can see color, and there's a paper in front that is in the front is green, and then the back is red. For you, the paper as a colorblind person would be the same; it's gray, right? For the person who basically sees color, he's like, no, this is not true. This has color, right? So how do you know if he's lying or not? If there's true color or not?
Right.
And the person maybe doesn't want to reveal which color the sides have, right? So what you do is, and this is the proof. It's got an interactive CK proof. You as a colorblind person, you take the paper, and you're gonna hide it behind your hand, and gonna sometimes flip it or not. And then you show it again to the person who sees color. And if the person says you just flipped it, or says you don't flip it, and if you do this 1,000,000 times, then it's pretty likely that this paper actually has two colors, right? Otherwise, it would be impossible.
They would know, right?
They would know, right? But the person who told you that, now you know he knows, but he didn't reveal anything about the color. He didn't reveal anything how he did this. And this is a kind of a CK proof. Right? It's a proof that he knows, but he didn't reveal how or didn't reveal anything else.
Yeah. And as I understand it, I mean, it's essentially now moving from the field of cryptography into applicable technologies with our blockchain, you know, essentially layer 2s that can give app developers a sense of accessibility to using this core idea, these proofs, so that we could build into technology systems the ability for a community to selectively decide to share certain information and to hold back the stuff that they want to keep proprietary, that they want to keep in their treasure box, but still, you know, be able to fulfill whatever that intended use case was, that the other party knows that they have that data or that they were able to derive a specific insight of that data. So for example, maybe it's some sort of threshold of an ecological measurement, and you can prove that ecological measurement without showing all the data that defined the measurement underneath.
100%. Yeah. I think one of the really interesting use cases we are exploring about this as well is proof that you own this land without revealing any of the documents that you own this land, right?
Yeah.
Like you can prove data, like land ownership, but you of course don't want to send kind of all these documents to someone who can steal it or take it. So you can create a secret proof that just scans the document and just takes the most important information and just verifies it on chain. Yeah, it's true. Without any sending anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Another thing that we saw in the grants round that we recently ran, and GainForest was a participant, but we had the comment from a couple applications that they didn't want to give us their geo coordinates because land defenders and kind of conflict zones that they don't want those coordinates necessarily revealed. Makes it very hard to verify what's happening there. But yeah, it got me kind of scratching my head to think about those use cases as well. Okay, so essentially it sounds like you're partnering with these communities. It's a very community-centric approach, and you're trying to provide them with income, tools, cutting-edge data, AI assistance. Help me understand where the funding for those communities comes from. Like, presumably you're helping to connect them to flow of funds, and maybe some commentary on like this idea of avoided deforestation has actually had a huge decrease in funding with the Vera carbon credits controversies over the last couple of years. And there's, in the technology space, a lot of emphasis on permanence and direct air capture. And, we can't necessarily trust forests as the mechanism for carbon sequestration. But it's very dear to my heart. You're taking a different approach, which is, absolutely trying to defend our remaining ecosystems. So yeah, commentary on all of those themes and where you're getting the funding for these local groups.
So right now, most of our funding that goes towards funding GainForest as well as the local communities come from grants. And these could be very different sources. It could be academic grants. It could be Web3 grants, like Web3 ecosystem grants, basically, or directly from family offices as donations or corporations as well.
And those are grants to GainForest.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Not necessarily pegging it to a specific community.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That is donations to GainForest. But I guess just to clarify that, Gitcoin grants, whatever we raised from Gitcoin goes directly to the communities. Because we kind of pegged that as our community fund. And so we use that money to buy equipment, donate that to the communities, and capacity building as well as for conservation data income. We also help our communities onboard them into Web3 grants funding as well. And so, for example, we teach them what is Web3, what is conservation data income, how do we actually make it so that we can provably show that your work or your environmental impact work has been impactful, and how does that make it so that more donations would flow in because they know that you are a trusted organization because of all of these environmental metrics that we can measure on GainForest. And so that's also something that we do with the communities. We also help source grants that they could apply to. We're
actually super proud that we have 2 of our community members in the MyEarth grant.
Cool.
Yeah, so we have this road to Gitcoin where I think 3 rounds ago, we decided, I mean, it's okay for GainForest to take kind of the Web3 lead and like try to be like this entry point for Web3 funding that channels back to the communities. But what we really want is to empower communities to, one day if GainForest might not exist, that node maybe fails and gets compromises or whatever, that the funding still goes to communities. So we have this Road to Gitcoin program where whoever is interested signs up to us. We have a one-on-one kind of like mentoring for all these community members to create a Gitcoin profile page, application, how this all works. And in the last round, in climate round, we had Kobek from Kenya participating in a climate round, which was the first one, which we're really proud of. And then for MyEarth, 5 of our projects applied. They were all interested, and we helped them with the application, and 2 got accepted.
Cool. Which 2 were those?
Bees and Trees in Uganda.
Yeah.
Love them. And Soralo.
Nice.
So both of them basically got into the MyEarth grants rounds, and I think that is something we're really, really proud of. I think to answer your question on the carbon credit side, because I think that is a big one. So we at GainForest, we kind of looked into carbon credits a little bit more, and initially we wanted to start we initially also thought about using it as a way to reward the communities, like as a carbon credit token or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look clearly how a carbon credit is calculated, there are already multiple things which I think are disincentivizing honesty. First, the carbon credit is the difference between your impact and your baseline, what would have happened if the project didn't start, the counterfactual, right? And then that counterfactual is super difficult to estimate. So you just take something easy for people to understand, but also something that favors your carbon credit issuance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the whole scandal was last year with Vera, because they basically took the historic deforestation rate from like 10 years ago, even knowing that it was falling already. And so it was really high. You just projected it for the next 100 years, and then you issued the credits. And now there was just a simple science experiment, basically using a method called synthetic control or dynamic baseline, how it's called now, seeing that, oh, no, that's not true. Like that historic average is like 90% off.
Mm-hmm.
So that's already difficult, right? And it creates a whole trust issue. But even worse, if you look clearly of how a carbon credit from a single tree comes out, right now what we do is we do allometric equations because we really don't know how much biomass a tree has. It's a mathematical model. And actually, we model every kind of tree. We measure the diameter at breast height, kind of as a standard. Then we calculate the wood density of that tree that is specific to that species, and we put a number in. But during the whole process, we just estimate the tree to be like a cylinder, removing all its shapes. And then by itself, this process of allometric equation, carbon assignment, has roughly 40 to 50% uncertainty. So that's the ground truth data we use to basically calculate carbon credits and values. So we are like, if carbon credits are nothing but like really good data points, and high quality carbon credits are just high quality data on the forest, why don't we just start with the data itself and think about other ways this can be valued that doesn't require kind of, I would say, almost arbitrary accounting, like with the baseline impact, but look into real world use cases of data that already exists that people would pay for, like decision-making processes that can get simplified, like policy making that needs data to understand better, like news medias that need data to report really fast, right? Or just someone who just likes to listen to YouTube videos of sound in the forest sounds, right? So this is where data actually already has revenue streams that doesn't depend on this next level of accounting.
I see. So you're thinking about it that the economic opportunity is really monetizing the data directly, not taking it through an intermediating credit system. And do you see enough meaningful use cases or demand use cases for environmental data that you think can kind of scale funding for nature in these communities? Or do you think this is incrementally good, but not like far too insufficient for the task? Or do you think that this is a stopgap until governments get more sane and put more money into conservation? Or like, how do you imagine this fitting into the broader picture of how much capital we really need for these types of ecological measures?
This is a really good question. So we know that data has true value because we can see that the digital economy is the largest economy in the world. And if we can connect local communities and nature to the digital economy, and even if we trickle down a little bit of percentage of that humongous economy, then we can fund nature more directly. I think data provides two types of really interesting values. On the one hand, if you are able to manage data well and analyze it, so on the data collecting and capacity building side, you yourself gain data skills that allow you to access the digital economy. So when communities are flying the drone, installing bioacoustic sensors, cleaning up the data later, storing it locally on their hardware servers, right? You knowing how to use the chatbot, data itself kind of serves as an educational tool to build new skills for the communities that they can one day use to be completely independent from conservation data income itself, but kind of climb up the ladder of the digital economy. So our whole dream one day would be that through the whole process of collecting data, we create truly indigenous scientists on their own, data scientists, that can use the data to create machine learning models, AI models, and then that can benefit their communities. And that would explode in use cases, right? On the other hand, we've seen data already being interested, not on a large scale yet, but on a smaller scale. We had purchases, for example, for proofs that trees have been planted, simply a picture of a tree that has been planted, right? That's a use case of the data. We've seen, for example, right now there's a drought in the Amazon in Rio Negro. And it's the worst drought in many, many years. One of the communities we work with very closely in Habe, usually it takes 20 minutes to get there by boat from Manaus, but now it takes 4 hours to walk there because and it's hot, there's dengue, mosquitoes, it's really, really not, and then the fish died, right? So it's a crisis. It took global news outlets, I think a month, almost 2 months to report on this. The communities already knew it's happening, right? They were already sending us the data saying it's happening. We need support, right? And that data really was valuable in that sense as well. And then the last use case that we had, and that was a really interesting one because they turned into two, is initially we got a really big grant from MIT Media Lab to collect data to calibrate carbon credit satellite algorithms. So satellite algorithms that predict carbon credit. Most of the data in the world on biodiversity is actually in the global north. So all the data ever collected on nature, there's actually a database for this, GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And if you look at simple statistics, where the data points are located, 82.7% are all in North America and Europe. And the rest is distributed around the rest of the world. And fun fact, not so fun fact, actually a sad fact, 0.5% of all the data ever collected is in the Amazon rainforest, which has 15% of biodiversity estimated, right? So there's a huge data gap. And as an AI researcher, if you put in biased data in, you get biased algorithms out, like garbage in, garbage out. So there's a need for high quality data sets to train high quality algorithms for measuring, monitoring, anything that has to do with the environment. And so we collected that data set in the Philippines. That was really, really wonderful. Kind of proved the concept that this data is valuable. We actually published it also in a scientific report. So it had multiple things. And there was this one site in the Philippines where we measured these mangroves, where we just initially went into the mangrove forest, but then we stopped because there's too many mosquitoes. So if you look at the green globe, there are a couple of points there on the right side where it's kind of disconnected to the whole plot. We decided to just measure it. And then last year, we overlaid this data with satellite imagery, so locally collected data with satellite imagery. And we saw that the satellite imagery, it turned from green to brown, right? And we're like curious what's happening right now. We asked the communities to fly a drone to capture like a drone image of the area. And we saw that the local mayor has decided to cut down the forests to create a parking lot for a festival nearby, which is illegal. Like he cut down the mangroves that we measured. And then when the community basically approached the mayor and asked him, hey, what's going on? The mayor was like saying, no, the mangroves were already like this, completely already looked like this. The data was really helpful to prove them wrong. We literally could show him the tree that like doesn't exist anymore, right? Like the species, everything. And then we showed that how can you lie like with such obvious evidence, right? And then actually I was able to enforce action because a higher level institution looked at it then and said, this is not okay. You have to like compensate for the mangroves that you cut down. So data itself,
got it.
I think is just really important for so many different use cases.
Going back to your question again. So I think one of the reasons why carbon credits exist is because carbon is quite easy relatively to measure. You can just, you have an equation, you have the type of tree, how high that tree is, and you have a estimated carbon. But that is something that's easily gamified. And so now there's a little bit of distrust in this carbon markets because it's a metric and it's one singular metric that's easily gameable. And I think if you want to create a more accurate representation of the environment itself. So not just carbon, but maybe air quality, soil quality, species richness, all sorts of other environmental metrics. We first need to be able to gather the data in order to understand what it is that we're measuring and what environmental metrics are important.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to move towards creating a standard where you start from, okay, we have carbon credits. It's maybe a great start, but not the full picture. How do we go to something that's more full picture? And so the first step is to create this biodiversity database. And right now, a lot of the data on biodiversity is in areas where it's in the global north and not so much in the near the equators where we actually have forests.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able, the first step really to think about this is to be able to measure what it is that we want to value and then create these environmental insights.
Mm-hmm.
And who better to create these data points than the people who are on the ground who maybe know the animal species much better than we do, who can identify a lot of different metrics that we don't know.
Right. So how in this, as this matures, because so we have this proliferation of data from the environment that's being accelerating because of the technology, right? So you mentioned bioacoustics, you mentioned drones, we've talked about satellites, environmental DNA. And so if that continues, and then we take this grassroots community, locally led approach of giving them sovereignty of choosing how they want to share that data, and when they do share it, they get paid for it. But what happens once we bring this together into these databases and these data repositories, and then we're selling it to media outlets or, governments or corporates or whomever? Like, is that, help me see your vision for the licensing kind of implications of this and kind of the open nature of it or closed nature of it, and how does this mature into a data economy that's sustainable but isn't a walled garden?
So we had long discussions in our data council on this, on the data policy. One of the things that I think this is where Web3 now comes in. We listen and observe the problems on the ground. And then we kind of activate our Web3 mindset. Like, okay, interesting. So we need provenance. We need to track who's using what. We need like royalties, like recurring incomes, and we need use cases. Is it used for like non-commercial purposes, or is it used for commercial purposes? Right. So our thinking at its current standard is that once these data sets are getting released, there's going to be two kind of licenses. One is a non-commercial license that's open for science, that you can use that data openly. And then there's a commercial license that requires you to put back a certain amount of your profits back into the data collectors. That can be implemented either through hypercerts, through definitely through tracking of the use of data through tools that, for example, Devonian Systems is implementing, like Cherty, or through something that we are trying to pioneer right now, which is called retrieval augmented generation biodiversity mechanism, where a chatbot, when you ask it a question, for example, you pay the chatbot per token. But then if there's too much information for the chatbot to query, it knows exactly which one it has to select, which data point it has to select to put it into kind of the answer. And that selection mechanism could just pay back. Once it selects, it could just pay back the data owner. So like these are kind of mechanisms where we believe we can create recurring income to data collectors, which incentivizes more high quality and large scale data collection. So it could be a flywheel for purposes like this. But I think one really major lesson we learned is that these questions are really difficult and are best solved in an open, inclusive council, a specific data council that really addresses these questions in co-design with the communities. So this data council is something we're really, really proud of. We started this initially for the XPRIZE to allow community members to be part of our XPRIZE team But then we decided to adopt this for all of GainForest. So all the community members, there's every 6 months we have a voting period where from all the communities that exist, we select a representative for South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. These locations are arbitrarily decided right now, depending on the locations of our communities. But then each of them basically forms a council, and then 3 members of our team form the council. And we basically meet every 3 weeks to discuss exactly these questions and decide how is the policy used, what's the kind of price of conservation data income, and what are the next kind of roads, depending on data that we need. For example, data fellowships were discussed and is currently in process of getting implemented. So the communities gave us so many new insights and ideas that I think already made this whole council experiment such a wonderful, wonderful idea and experience that we want to also share to the broader environmental community.
Nice. That's definitely also feels like you had your Web3 DAO hat on when
100%. Yeah.
You mentioned Devonian. So for those watching or listening, Devonian is co-founded by Alan Ransel, who we've had on the show speaking to Filecoin Green, and Cherty is kind of a new expression of that work, and people can dive in. It's a lot of the same kind of technical aspects of hashes and Merkle trees and these fun conversations that Alan is such a good steward for. You brought up hypercerts and our shared friend Hoke. I would love to talk about what do you see as the use cases here. We're also excited about hypercerts with kind of the Ma Earth grants rounds and kind of how we think about helping to make impact visible to funders. But yeah, like how are you seeing it play a role in these use cases that you were referring to?
I think one use case that we're exploring right now, and we're going to launch a platform very soon on this exact concept, is how do we ensure that if an organization has demonstrated that they have done great environmental impact, how do we make it so they do not have to continually look for funding in order to sustain their operations? And how can they make sure that they can keep growing? And so one great way that we can use hypercerts is to take the impacts that they've done before. Like say I have planted 10,000 trees. I have improved the soil quality in this area. So it could be different ways. So I've done this. This is all of the proof. You can see it in the hypercert. You can see all of the GainForest information kind of plugged in there. So you know, and you can trace back where that data has been computed. So you know that. We put it in a marketplace, and anyone in the world can say, hey, that's great work. We want to buy that impact. And so what that kind of looks like is it's basically kind of retroactive funding for what they've done. But that funding makes it so that now they have more funding to be able to continue their future operations. So that's one way. And the other way is to also be able to say, hey, we want to do milestone X, Y, and Z in the future. We need this much amount of money in order to do that. And so for the projects that maybe are still starting out, or maybe they don't have the data collected quite yet, so we have that option as well. So there's 2 options. One, to be able to say, hey, these are my milestones. Please help us fund the impact. And the second option would be, hey, we have already done these. Please help us. Please fund that impact. So please be the donor as if you are the person that's funding the impact before it was created. But this would be able to be used in the future.
And also, I think one thing I really want to add on this is impact evaluation. So the hypercert structure allows projects to clearly express what they have done as an outcome, which allows us then to verify this or not. One of the things that we noticed in the regenerative finance space is that impact evaluation and measurements currently are second-class citizens. They are nice to have, but they don't there. What is the consequence? Gitcoin feels like more like a marketing round than it is like an impact round, right? So basically contributions are more on the perceived value side. And one way you can, like perceived value is of course your true value, like what you're doing on the ground. But then you can also increase it simply by putting a lot of effort into marketing to make your project look more than it is, right? So hypercerts allow you to clearly state what is your results and impact, And then we at GainForest have developed all this conservation data income sources, the data sets, the algorithms to monitor. And then we can link, for example, and we just released an API called Trace. For example, when your impact is you planted 30,000 mangroves in Kenya and you display these locations on a hypercert, then we can run our satellite algorithms and see, okay, if you've planted them for 2 years, they must be visible. It's such an enormous number of trees, right? And if there's not visible, there's no green, then we send committee members there to take a drone image. And if we still don't see them, well, we have to issue a report and say, that's kind of sketch, you know? And that is then clearly used to attest on chain, and it links back to the reputation of the person who claimed this, right? And that allows us really to filter and allow also donors to distinguish between real impact or good marketing.
Yeah, I think that alignment of economic incentives of the evaluators to the purchasers of the impact and the sellers of the impact, like that core nugget is what got me the most excited about hypercerts, because I could see a world where this environmental data is warehoused and sold on. Like, we have those models of data brokers that exist on the internet for lots of different types of data sets. We've been doing that for 20, 30 years. We could see how those industries form and mature. And like, I've played in that space in previous lives. And I think it's valid and it can work in different ways. But I think it's just really powerful if we can incentivize the evaluation into the same economic stream as the purchase. So, you know, I want to pay for that impact of planting those 30,000 mangroves. Great. 10% or 5% or 15%, whatever the number is, of that economic exchange between me, the funder, and the person on the ground doing the work that made the impact, it goes to the verification stream. And then that creates this kind of virtuous loop of the incentive structure for people to come evaluate, measure, verify impact. Whereas today, we don't have those incentives baked into the natural loops. And if we can kind of create that in a refined way, then we can also make sure that it's continually incentivizing higher and higher quality or different forms of data verification. So, for example, you know, maybe I fulfilled some carbon credit commitment, but people can supplement that with like, well, no, this actually was devastating for the biodiversity because you did monocrop pine plantations, or this one over here, like there's actually all these co-benefits that can actually be visible now in the same fundamental impact certificate. What do you think of all that, or what's that provoke?
100%. So one of the things we've been also talking to Gitcoin is to think about and not QF, quadratic funding, because of the problems we just mentioned. But we call it IQF, impact quadratic funding, that multiplies the contributions, that re-rates the contributions of each contributor by the overall impact measured of this project. So imagine this, every project has like an impact passport where they can collect these impact stamps from impact evaluators. This impact passport is basically your passport to show that your hypercert has verified so many impacts, right? Like you have like a huge impact score. And then that will be multiplied on quadratic funding. And then a project can decide, should I spend a lot of my budget into marketing to increase like small scale donations, or should I actually spend my marketing budget rather into on-ground budget to increase my impact score, which is actually what we want, right? And so this at GainForest, we are super excited to explore right now to see if this is something we can integrate and also pioneer in the Web3 space.
And it's something that a lot of different projects can use as well. It's not just environmental projects, but the concept can be applied to basically all of the rounds.
I could speak on those topics with you for a long time, but I do want to ask you a few more things. So, I mean, you're both rare birds traveling in these different worlds of environmental focus, AI, crypto, Web3. Do your climate friends kind of raise eyebrows sometimes at like, oh, you're getting involved in AI or Web3? And like, how do you respond to the skepticism and the critiques? I'm so curious. So also, you can give me some lines here. But yeah, I mean, we see comments on the videos of like, yeah, you talk about AI, but are you taking into consideration the energy footprint of that, or crypto? All this speculative casino tech bros, going to try to escape the financial system and resort to their libertarian islands. Like, how does that going to change the world? And yeah, how do you filter and think about those dialogues, and then also respond to it?
I guess speak a little bit about the crypto side. So depending on the audience, we may just say that we use Web3 for the transparency layer, data transparency, as well as financial transparency, and being able to track like the donations with the actual environmental impact. And I think, there is a lot of noise out there, but some of that noise is not really important to what we're doing. And one great thing about Web3 is that it is a pioneer in unlocking new financial mechanisms, and how do we it allows us to start thinking and dreaming about how to best allocate funds for climate impact, how to best measure it. And that's the part of the Web3 that we're using and utilizing. We don't need to go to speculation with tokens and all of that other stuff. We can just ignore that. It doesn't serve us. And we can just focus on what is really important.
Yeah. I remember a friend of mine, she told me first, when she first heard about us and first heard about my work, like, oh, it's crypto AI. She thought I'm a scammer, right? But then she realized that I'm the guy who did this and this in AI, and she knew about my work in like just AI research. She's like, oh, wow, okay, maybe he is legit, but I'm unsure, so it really helped that I actually did a PhD in AI. So like people say, okay, this guy's actually legit. He has like Agent blah, blah, blah. But then she's like, okay, it got her interested. And it requires a little bit of thinking if that actually makes sense. And I think how Sharfy explained it right now, that we make sure we explain the parts we need from crypto that are really important, like the transaction from A to B that is instant and also requires only a digital connection compared to all the paperwork before. And also the funding mechanisms, right? If we explain this clearly, it makes totally sense. The technology can speak for itself. It doesn't require any hype and stuff like this. But also the other part on the AI side, and my environmental friends, they definitely mentioned a lot about, isn't crypto super energy inefficient? And also don't we need like cities to power AI algorithms up? I think there's a misconception between what kind of crypto, what kind of AI we're using. Like our models are not necessarily, we're not training large language models from scratch to create these. And this is where like all the power sources come in. We actually use very frugal models, like very cheap, power efficient ones. And then we can actually measure a lot of the impact these models have compared to how less of gasoline you, for example, have to use to now patrol the site, right? Like if you fly a drone and you capture a drone image, and then we can run an AI algorithm to detect the trees and tell you these are the kind of the palms that are existing, then you don't have to like pay for gasoline to travel on a river to find these palms. So it's actually more efficient and saves more on the environment than without using it. And I'm quite proud to say that I convinced some of my climate friends to study AI. Nice. I gave them like a one-on-one course. We also teach the communities to do this, as like look into AI not just as something to use, but something to understand and also take advantage and also co-design the discipline itself, because we need more people from the communities to think about AI. Otherwise, it becomes problematic, like becomes power hungry. So some of our environmental friends are actually now taking some of our AI courses as well, like privately.
Nice. Okay, well, I have two more topic questions I wanted to ask you. One is, you've structured so far as a nonprofit. Can you share more about that thinking and those considerations and those tensions, what you're learning? If you say AI and crypto and, I have a PhD in AI research from ETH, and like, you could probably go raise millions of dollars from eager venture capitalists tomorrow. Like, why a nonprofit, and how's that been so far?
It's been tough. But we believe the nonprofit side is the best way for us to show to the community an alternative to the existing sustainable financings. So when we first started in this space and we looked into what is out there, nothing of what is out there spoke to what we believe is the right way, right? MRV monitoring is like satellite-based, and some startup in Silicon Valley is sitting there developing huge resource-hungry servers to charge grassroots organizations to like monitor their impact. Carbon credits are like having middlemen that are earning so much of that value chain, and we don't even know if the money goes to the communities, right? And then the numbers are also faulty, and you allow them to offset. If they're faulty, you actually allow them to emit more. So we are like not okay with what is out there, and we wanted to think and co-design and find a truly viable alternative that can inspire the community to think about other things than what they have been told. And so we like, what about co-designing with communities technology, right? Super counterintuitive. You take people who have no computer science degree and you put them into the value chain. And now, okay, let's see what happens, right? What technologies are coming out when you bring them in? Or what about looking at the data itself as a sustainable finance mechanism instead of like trying to do accounting, right? And all of these concepts they were fussy for us. They were hard to grasp, but we wanted them to be done right and not selling out communities or people we trust and they trust us. Somewhere in the middle for profit, because we needed time to do the research. We needed time to understand what are the important factors and building blocks to make this happen, to inspire the community, to just be an existing alternative, right? And that I don't think fits with a for-profit model. I cannot, back then when we started, especially, I don't think we could find an investor who says, take your time. Yes, totally include like non-computer science people, indigenous knowledge into your tech team. Like it's too crazy to sell this. But we know it was the right choice. So, and we know we will fail a lot until we find what is correct. So the nonprofit was the only viable option. We have to have full freedom in our creative design process of designing this solution that we just presented to you. And we cannot have anyone telling us, sell the communities. What is the equity? Push, be faster, right? Because it needs time. Good ideas need to, like this is what we learned when working with the communities. If you rush them, if you say, okay, ship, or like, oh, what's the next milestone? They will lose trust in you because this is not how they work. Like all that, we call it wisdom, not because it's rushed, but because it's learned over many centuries, right? Or thousands of years. And they've told through storytelling, they refined it and they learned what works, what doesn't work. And we wanted to adopt this approach as well when it comes to designing our solution, right? Now we're in a process where I told you it's tough because it of course requires, it basically challenges us of what kind of funding we can take and what kind of funding we cannot take, not just on how to move forward, but also on what kind of values this funding includes, right? Because like our mission is to really show that integrity can bring you to the solution. And that comes, of course, with funding issues. I can be very open to this. Like this is like the Web3 community. If we wouldn't be there, I think I wouldn't have my credentials and the community wouldn't know us for our work. And it took years. We wouldn't be here, right? We wouldn't have survived the bear market. So I think it comes with a cost for sure. And that's something we've been discussing a lot in the team as well. Like how can we balance off finding a really good solution that fits our imagination of how the world should move forward, but also how do we scale the solution then to address the urgency of the problem, which is the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis that we're facing, which we only have less than 5 or 6 years left to really find a good solution that scales, right? And so we are in the phase at GainForest right now where we're at a crossroads. We have participated in XPRIZE to gain more reputation and credibility in the space to show that we are not just dreamers, we are winners. This algorithm, this approach can actually win. And now I think we're in a phase where we feel like we're not piloting anything anymore. We feel like we have a good grasp of this is how it will work. And we feel like we're collecting enough evidence potentially to convince value-aligned investors to join our path now to address the second part, which is the urgency of the problem. So internally, we have been discussing about moving now with the solution we have co-designed for so many years into a for-profit space, but we are in the beginning of these thinking processes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think that the biggest disadvantage of the venture capital model is raising too much money too quickly, because you essentially entrench a certain amount of capital interests and incentives around what you mentioned, the speed, scale, the things that get lost in that. And when we're trying to build paradigm shifting solutions that work with nature, not to extract nature, and with communities, not to do crazy top down, economies of scale, and that doesn't blend well with the venture model in those very early stages. But if you have something that has years of thoughtfulness, and you can kind of find product market fit to some extent before you find those impact aligned investors who know the model, they understand what they're getting into. There's kind of a better power dynamic between the founders and the investors, and the amount of speed, scale, incentive structure that you're baking in terms of what types of returns, and all of those things are better done if you can be patient in those founding stages. And I actually think, this has come up when talking to Gmo at Sylvie and Hoke at Hypercerts, and I actually think regardless of where Gitcoin goes from here, one of the lasting impacts of these first 22 rounds might be that it created some breathing room for teams like yours to kind of figure it out before they decided which direction to go next. And Donella Meadows talks about this in terms of systems interventions, and I don't remember the exact framing, but kind of creating buffers and slowing down certain processes. And I do think that that's been a huge gift to this Web3 community and ecosystem. Yeah.
And I do think it's very dangerous because trust is something that takes time to build. Trust with communities is something that takes time to build. And having a go fast mentality, we need that data yesterday, is a great way to lose all that trust. And basically, trust is not just to our organization, but to organizations as a whole. Maybe that community is like, oh, we've had a bad experience with X, Y, and Z. Maybe we don't want to collect data, especially with communities that have been historically exploited for either natural resources or data. They are very rightly so, suspicious of trusting newcomers. And so being able to take the time to keep coming back to the communities, slowly grow relationships, and also think about their concerns is super important, because once we lose that trust, it's difficult to keep growing that again.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we'll just have to balance it with that tension of the urgency that we feel from the crisis at hand, and how much do we have time to get it right versus how much do we have to scale up imperfect solutions. And kind of got Johan Rockström's voice in the back of my head going, we don't have time to create new economic paradigms. We have to just use the corporates and the political institutions at hand, because this is urgent and we must move now. And respect a lot his opinion and work, of course. And this is the paradoxical tension, I guess, that we're all riding.
Yeah, but he's not in Web3. He doesn't know how fast we can create new economic paradigms here.
Well, that would be a great place to end it. But I did want to congratulate you on the XPRIZE. You're one of the finalists. You're one of the winners. Share a bit at a high level the XPRIZE, what it is, the submission, and the recognition is a huge honor.
I think the XPRIZE is a great way for us to start developing some of the environmental insights that are important for creating a more kind of holistic, if that's the word, kind of credit system, or to just be able to think about what environmental metrics are important. And now that we have validated some of those algorithms and some of those environmental insights, I think it's a really great place to finally be able to say, hey, we've done 3 years of work with a lot of leading universities to try to create this. Like, it's the perfect time to be able to say, we've done all our pilots. We can now start thinking about scaling to start capacity building, using it in a lot of different countries, trying to learn what are the differences between one country and another, and also to be able to try to visualize this form of hypercerts, for example. How do we create great impact certificates with the right environmental metrics? And I think we really have thought that through, the environmental insight and metrics space. And so I think we're in a really great position to finally be able to kind of scale.
Nice.
To answer your question what the XPRIZE is, so XPRIZE Foundation launches these also economic paradigms, incentive prizes, like large amounts of prizes, money. Like they started with the Lunar XPRIZE, which is like the first private company that makes it to the moon. $10 million, 10 years. It's usually like that, like a large money amount, and then enough time to incentivize and coordinate research and development efforts around this prize to achieve the goal. It did a lot for space exploration, actually. Like it created a lot of hype and a lot of research and development into this area that brought us to where we are now. And for the Rainforest XPRIZE, that was started 2018 when the rainforest was burning in the Amazon. And a very wealthy Brazilian family actually decided, no, we have to dedicate a prize towards protecting the rainforest. And what they were deciding the prize for was to have a competition around going into the rainforest, measuring 100 hectares of forest in 24 hours without entering the forest, and then having 48 hours afterwards to gather as many insights, and insights is very fuzzy here, as possible, right? $10 million prize pool. More than almost 300 teams applied.
Wow.
Yale University, Duke University, all the universities, and GainForest. And then
that's some healthy competition.
It's a good competition. Because one of the things when we participate in XPRIZE, we at GainForest are like, when we talk about impact evaluation measurement, we better put our money where our mouth is.
Yeah.
Right. So who's evaluating us? So someone needs to evaluate us. And what best than the Biodiversity Olympics, the biggest competition that our field has ever seen, right? To evaluate that we are like legit, so we can like serve as a trust center for anything that we do afterwards. So yeah, that's why we are crazy. We're like, okay, why not? Let's do it. Let's win it. And then over several years, we ended up being a semi-finalist. So 16 teams became semi-finalists. And in the semi-finals, we actually merged with the ETH Zurich team that we are based in Zurich. So ETH Zurich was like, after a while, wow, there's a second team in Switzerland. We never heard about it. It's not a university. Who are they, right? And so we talked, we consolidated, we realized like we bring like AI and community engagement. They bring other fields of technologies like drone operation and eDNA. And we decided to merge together and formed a bigger team called BiodiffX. And that team then participated in the semifinals in Singapore, where we did the 24 hours of monitoring and 48 hours of analysis in the Singapore reservoir. We won that, and we ended up becoming one of the 6 finalists this year to get a randomly assigned plot in the Amazon rainforest, go there with the team and prove our solution, right? And we were doing, I think, very well. We don't know yet at this point which prize we won, but we received that we won one of the prizes, and that's a huge honor to not only us and our intention to prove that we're legit, to prove to all impact evaluators that impact evaluators itself has to be evaluated and benchmarked for accountability, but also, and that's what we always hoped it would hopefully come in, to prove that Web3, we're the only team that used Web3 in conservation data, the only team that involved communities into the co-design of the technology, the only team that paid out the communities for collection of data. So we pioneered kind of a new idea. I think the XPRIZE team really liked that.
Mm.
the judges also really liked that idea. And we hope that this approach is inspiring others to look into this approach as a valid alternative for conservation financing, and also as a valid alternative towards science itself, where you have these elite universities and they travel with planes to collect data in the rainforest. But instead, you have all these amazing people in the local communities that can collect the data, gain these insights locally for you. So decentralizing science.
Mm-hmm.
So we are hoping to prove with this win that this is a valid opportunity to beat all the universities and actually move forward with something truly eye-opening, a new stage of science, a new stage of conservation financing.
Mm-hmm.
That was nothing less than that was our ambition when we participated, and we hope that win can inspire.
Mm.
Yeah, I think our ambition is based on the fact that talent is distributed all around the world, but opportunity is not. And so how do we actually get the opportunity for people to work on environmental research and really access a lot of these opportunities that are available, more easily available to people in different areas? And how do we bring that to the local communities?
Mm.
Because we do believe that they're also one of the best people to be able to give these insights.
Yeah, and outbeat all the universities.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, it's
like
been
it's so
proven.
clear. It's like, of course, indigenous scientists outbeats all the universities. They are indigenous scientists. They live in the rainforest. Like your biology master or PhD doesn't beat someone who has thousands of years of experience. And that is something I think science needs to understand.
Mm. Super inspirational. I feel like the two of you are far ahead of the pack, and we'll be rooting you on. Excited to know more about GainForest now. Any final messages you want to share? Or closing thoughts?
I think one of the things when we talk about, and that's what I really appreciate about this podcast, is that we put humans at the center of this discussion, because the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, and the biodiversity crisis is a crisis that is not about hot weather or like about smoke in the forest. It's a symptom, but it's actually the largest humanitarian crisis we ever will face, and we are facing right now. So a humanitarian crisis can only be solved with humanitarian values, with values that are considering the people on the ground, that are humane, that are not tech-centric, but that are looking at what nature really is, because we people are part of nature. Technology itself is nature. Like all these electrons, everything is actually nature, right? So if you want to tackle the nature crisis, you need to tackle it in a way that really has this holistic approach of we as humans are part of nature, and therefore we need to be part of the solution. And I hope that this was clear when we were like communicating in this podcast. I think this is something that is really dear to our heart. That communities need to be involved in every single step.
Yeah, I think that the climate problem is really a kind of a financial distribution problem as well. And so I'm really excited to be part of Web3, where we're actively thinking about impact metrics, financial mechanisms, and bringing access to people who do not have access to financial systems and also opportunity. And so what I'm really excited about in GainForest is really just this. And I really want to emphasize that we're decentralized science, community first. Yeah, we want to make sure that the finances go towards the people that are the best people that can help us solve and help fix the climate problems.
Excellent. Sharfy, David, thank you so much. To learn more about this excellent work from GainForest, just go to gainforest.earth. For more conversations, there were several names and groups mentioned in this discussion you might want to go deeper into. Holke from HyperCerts, we've had a couple conversations with him on the Ma Earth series. Will Marshall from Planet Labs around the satellite technology. Alan Ransell from Devonian with the new product Cherty. Also, Tom Crowther from Crowther Lab over at ETH. So many more great discussions exploring all of these themes and more on maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.